This is Hannibal here from the HannibalTV.com, and I just finished watching Hulk Hogan's most recent podcast interview, which, by the way, I was more interested to see this than anything else in wrestling this week. So Hulk Hogan is still a draw, at least to me. And I found this. This was probably his best podcast interview I've seen, far better than the Ariel Hawani one that he did recently. He was more relaxed for this one, and it was interesting. And he talked about different stuff overall. He when asked about the biggest difference between today's wrestling and his generation, I mean, I fully agree with him on this, and this is good insight. He says the difference now is merchandise is easier because of the internet, whereas before you had to get it in arenas and mail order, and now you can get it all over the world online. So there's a bigger merchandise market, and he says he still has merchandise deals with WWE. He says, and I agree with him on this 100%. Instead of wrestlers being the attractions now, where there used to be big stars like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man, Ultimate Warrior, The Rock, Steve Austin, everybody knew the wrestlers of the past. He says now wrestlers are very generic. Uh, there are some that look different, but for the most part, they're very cookie cutter. Most of them come from the performance center. They wrestle very much alike. They're easily replaceable. People are now going to the shows mostly for the production that is WWE. It's going to be a big setup, big production values. So, whereas in the past, when you went to a house show with Hulk Hogan on it, and I've been to my share of house shows with Hulk Hogan. Okay, I was and still am a big wrestling fan. I'm just not a fan of the current TV products. And I've never been a big fan of the production aspect of it. But like when Hulk Hogan, I remember when he would come out for shows in Ottawa at the Ottawa Civic Center, there was just a blue curtain that they pulled aside. It didn't even have a middle flap. They just pulled aside the blue curtain. He came out. There was a light over the ring. I remember once there was a spotlight, and other times there wouldn't be spotlights. I remember when Hogan wrestled Jacques Rougeau for WCW in Montreal. There, they just came out of a curtain in one of the hockey dressing rooms, and it was pandemonium when Hulk came out that night. You didn't need the big production. Now you need the big fancy Titantrons and all these lights and fireworks. I mean, he has a good point there. He said wrestlers looked more like men in those days. Now a lot of them look like they should bag groceries. That is true. That is true. And he also brought up in the past they ran 3 times a night, and if you got hurt, you would just, if you had a broken thumb from your match in the afternoon and had to wrestle somewhere that night, you just taped it up and got in the ring. Now you get an injury, you're off for weeks at a time or months at a time. 100% true. It was a different breed. It built for a different breed of wrestling and better characters because of the type of man you had to be to function in the business in those days, for better or worse. That's just a fact. And he said when he was in it, you worked for a percentage of the gate and a percentage of merchandise. Now there's guaranteed contracts. Of course, at various times he had guaranteed contracts, but he brings up that although the matches themselves might be a work, the competition for the money and the main event spots and the championships and winning or losing is not a work, because if you lose or you're not the champion, you don't make as much money. And why he wanted to stay a good guy for most of his career was because good guys, for most of the time he was in the wrestling business, made more money and sold more merchandise. That was one of the reasons why he was hesitant to turn bad. He talked about Rocky 3, being a big Rocky fan. By the way, a little something that Bill Apter said is Billy Graham was also considered for that Rocky 3 role. Hogan never brought that up in this at all. Billy Graham was not brought up. Not sure if it was taped before or after his death. Oh, by the way, he also said he owns a bar now. He talked a lot about the bar, but he does not drink. He said the reason he was over so big in Japan was because Fred Blassie was his manager, who was a huge star in Japan, and Hiro Masuda was his trainer. He said wrestling was a lot more intense in his days in Japan. It's very acrobatic now, and it's not the same as it used to be in Japan. He says the party scene in wrestling in the 70s and 80s is why so many wrestlers are dead right now. He talks about the shoot match that John Tenta had in Japan, which you can see this bizarre match with Katawa, I think the guy's name was, who Regis, I think Bobby Heenan called him Hand Towel. He was in WrestleMania 7. He said that he was supposed to wrestle Katawa that night, but this guy did not want to lose to him. So John Tenta volunteered to do the match instead. And he said when that guy tried to shoot on John Tenta, he was very happy he didn't take that match. And he said Tenta definitely held his own there. He put over Tenta. I mean, we knew that Tenta liked to wrestle, or Hogan liked to wrestle Tenta. He wrestled him a lot in WWE and WCW. I saw him wrestle Tenta in a stretcher match in '91 in Ottawa. And by the way, that house show was packed. That was packed to the rafters, and I believe they may have been in Montreal that afternoon as well that day. I'm almost positive. I seem to recall that. He's again with more of the WrestleMania 3 folklore. Andre the Giant had never been beaten before WrestleMania 3. He said he didn't know until right before the match that he was going to win. He said Andre drank 3 bottles of Crown Royal in the back before the match, and he was pouring Hogan shots, and Hogan was trying to dump out as many as possible so he wouldn't get drunk before the match. I mean, that's folklore. It's his story. He can tell it however the hell he wants. Most of these people, like the people doing this interview, admittedly said they knew Hulk Hogan, but they didn't know anything about wrestling. So he may as well exaggerate as much as he can. He did a great interview. I commend Hulk Hogan on this interview. He talked about, and this one didn't quite match up. He said he had a personal beef with Macho Man where they didn't talk for 8 years because Macho Man accused him of being the cause of his breakup with Elizabeth. But didn't Macho Man and Elizabeth break up at some point after WrestleMania 8? And then Macho Man and Elizabeth, after the divorce, were in WCW by like the mid 90s, it's 95, 96-ish. And Hogan wrestled Macho Man in WCW. So the period that they didn't talk would have had to have been after WCW. So I guess according to this, he was mad about the divorce, but they didn't stop talking until after WCW, but they made up just before his death in 2011. He also said Macho Man was champion so many times because he didn't mind doing business. He didn't mind getting pinned. He didn't mind losing. He said the reason Piper and Orndorff were never champion is because they didn't like to lose. And they if he would have done longer runs with those guys if they'd been willing to switch titles. We all know Piper was very protective. I never heard that about Orndorff, but by the time I met him, he was suffering from dementia. Very, very nice guy when I met Orndorff. He brought up Brett, thinking that Hogan sabotaged his career by refusing to drop the title to Brett after June or after WrestleMania 9, because Hogan won the title from Yoko right after Brett dropped the title to Yoko. And according to Brett, Hogan was supposed to drop the title to Brett. And Hogan said he was supposed to drop it to Yoko at the King of the Ring all along. To me, I tend more to believe Hogan on this one, because Hogan was a babyface and Brett was a babyface. And Hogan liked wrestling the big monster heels. So I couldn't imagine Hogan coming back agreeing to do that in the first place. The only thing I could see Hogan coming back, which he wasn't back for long, was to do the little run with Yoko. I don't see Hogan having a big babyface versus babyface run with Brett happening. I just don't see that happening. This part of Hogan, I don't know if I believe. He said he worked with Brett 8 or 10 times in WCW, and Brett didn't start hating him until after WCW closed down. Now, I know that they did have at least one match in WCW. When he's saying he worked with Brett 8 or 10 times, maybe they were in the ring together a total of 8 or 10 times. Around the time of the Hogan Sting feud and so forth, but I don't recall that they ever had 8 or 10 matches. I tried to look it up. I know there's a picture of them having a match at a house show in WCW. So I can tell you they had at least one match. He said Scott Steiner didn't want to job to him, is why he never had anything with Scott Steiner. He claimed that he'd been fired from WWE 3 or 4 times and quit WWE 3 or 4 times. We know he was fired, supposedly, according to folklore. Vince McMahon Sr. didn't like that he did the Rocky movie and said they weren't going to use him again, so that was at least once. The other time was over the whole Gawker-related controversy that everybody knows, and I'm not even going to get into again, go down that route. He suffered enough from that, and it appears to be done. The other times, I really don't know. The time when he was Mr. America, I think that there's supposed to be some ending there with Roddy Piper, but Piper ended up quitting or something, and Hulk Hogan disappeared soon after that. This is a funny story. I could see this being an exaggeration. He said he called Vince's private jet the slave ship because Vince would invite him to be on the jet one day and he'd be on the jet 17 or 18 days in a row. And his wife, he doesn't remember which wife at this point, he said, would get really mad at him because he'd be gone for so long. He said he had to sell his house in Connecticut to get away from Vince because Vince would constantly be inviting him on this quote-unquote slave ship. He said he was backstage at Gorilla with Vince watching the Jake the snake bite thing with Randy. I think Vince was actually commentating that, from what I recall. Maybe it was post-production. Hogan was on the show that night. I believe it actually was in Dayton, Ohio. I think it was October 21st, 91. It was recorded, I believe. Hogan said he was having surgeries every 4 to 6 months for the past 10 to 12 years before he started using CBD products. I don't know. I know he's had a lot of surgery. They did try. I bet he wasn't happy about this. There seemed to be a cut here, and he actually looked pissed, and the interview ended shortly after that. There was a kind of heavy-set guy. It showed towards the end there was like maybe 8 or 10 people watching on the other side of this hotel room where Hogan was doing this interview with 2 people. And at one point they said, "Can you slam this guy?" As if they were going to get Hogan to try and slam this fat guy. And it's like, I sympathize with Hogan here because it's like you're trying to expose me that I have handicaps now, and I'm not going to try and slam this guy. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. I've just been through a shitload of lawsuits, so I think Hogan looked pissed off at this part. Surgeries every 4 to 6 months for the past 10 to 12 years. That's a lot. I mean, I don't deny he's in a lot of pain. He told this story about getting Hooters girls with Ric Flair in Dayton, Ohio at one point. And Ric Flair was afraid that one of the girls was going to steal his coat. He claimed the first time he heard of a cell phone camera is when some fan took a picture of him in the shower naked in Pittsburgh after the matches. And one thing I found interesting about that, now, I mean, it's a good story, whatever, tell your stories. But he said he always drinks a few beers after the matches, and he had a match in Pittsburgh. You'd have to assume maybe this was in the Mr. Captain America or Mr. America era. And he said everyone had left. Everyone had left the arena. He was the only one in the arena. He had even told the security to leave the arena. Because you know what, I'm not, a story is a story, but I've worked arena security. At no point can like a certain star just say leave the arena, take the night off. You're hired by the building and the companies themselves for insurance reasons. You can't just leave. If a star tells you to leave, maybe the exact dressing room, you could tell the dressing room to go out. But he said he was sitting there naked, drinking beers after a show. Then he went in the shower, and he heard a click of a cell phone camera. And yes, that picture's mysteriously never come out. Anyways, good interview. I'm not hating on him at all on this one. I think that was one of his best interviews. I hope that Hogan does have his retirement match at the next WrestleMania. Graham, yeah, Billy Graham and Hulk Hogan. The last time I saw Hulk Hogan was that time with superstar Billy Graham, the man of the hour, the man with the power, too sweet to be sour, who would have turned 80 this week. But he's in a better place now. Mike Piper's right beside me, sleeping away. I'm not going to wake her. I think she may have been in another video today. I'm not sure. Good. I sold all my action figures this year. They were just taking up space. Jason. Yes, I agree with you. Hogan's real life history is impressive enough. The best story in his book is where he says he sweats so much that he sweats through the leather of like 24 to 26 title belts a month. Could you imagine having to sweat so much that your acid is so sweaty that they have to replace a title belt almost every day because your sweat is sweating right through the leather? Ric Flair exaggerates too. Just search up Ric Flair tells the story of being in the dressing room when Bruiser Brody was killed. It's on the internet. It's on the internet. The best guys know how to tell a story. Anyways, good interview. I liked it. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal